Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Breakfast with Gary and Elizabeth. This is our first co-sponsored early morning breakfast event, and I'm really honored to have my colleague, Elizabeth Glidden from the 8th Ward with us this morning. I'm Gary Shiff, and we do this final Friday of every month, except for November and December because the holidays get in the way. So this is the last one for 2010, and we'll be back in January, final Friday of the month, with the coveted 9th Ward Awards. And so I hope to see you all again. It's a great breakfast where we honor neighborhood activism and the good organizing work that happens in the South Side neighborhoods that I represent. And I want to also introduce my colleague, Meg Tuthill from the 10th Ward. Thank you for joining us this morning, Meg. And my former colleague, Paul Zerbe, formerly from the 2nd Ward, has joined us. And we're also joined by another esteemed elected official, Representative Karen Clark. And I don't think I missed any other electeds in the room. We are hoping to still be joined by one other guest speaker, Chuck Samuelson, from the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union. So if he comes, we will just give him his seat at the table. So, as introduction on this topic deals with specifics on a Supreme Court decision that came down in the last year, the last 6 months, a 6-3 vote from the Supreme Court that upheld a specific application of a federal law that itself has a long history. And this is regarding material aid to terrorism and the interpretation of that clause as used by the Federal Bureau of Investigations. There's a bit of a history on the law because it's been struck down by lower courts so many times, and it was upheld this summer in the 6-3 decision. So to ease you into the topic, I think I'm going to ask our guest speakers to first talk about the law a little bit. Or if you want, I could cover background on that. What do you think?
I would.
You will. All right. Bruce will. And then we'll talk about the specific case and what's at issue, and some of the people who are here in the audience who got a lot of their own personal liberty at stake. So with that, I want to introduce our guest speakers. I'm really honored to have Coleen Rowley here. Coleen was employed by the FBI for 24 years. Having retired from that position, she was singled out as Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2002. And she received that honor for her whistleblower status at the FBI when she called into question the lack of use of information that was supplied by the Minneapolis FBI office regarding Musawi and the attempted bombings that he was involved with. And she also was the DFL endorsed candidate in Minnesota's District Number 2 against John Klein in 2006. Thank you for being with us. Bruce Nestor owns and manages the De Leon and Nestor law firm located in the Corcoran neighborhood. And he has been actively outspoken against the search warrants that were served in South Minneapolis neighborhoods and has been quite involved with this case. He also practices criminal defense and immigration law. Thanks for being with us, Bruce. Elizabeth, any opening words of wisdom? All right. We'll start with, I guess, Bruce, if you want to go over the background of the law.
Good morning. I'm not used to hearing myself described as an owner and manager of a small business, but I guess that is part of my persona. So, my interest in this particular law, is not just because of my educational background as a lawyer in my practice, but also as an activist. And as an activist who has an analysis about who holds power in this country, and how this government exercises that power in the interest, in furtherance of certain interests abroad. So I put this, the material support for terrorism law, in a context going back to 1789 and the Alien and Sedition Acts, which really were the first time that the national government passed laws explicitly designed to target aliens as well as people engaged in sedition or dissent. Or fast forwarding it to the Palmer raids around World War I, where the U.S. entry into World War I and the military national security, the surge in patriotism was used as an effort to really disembowel the Socialist Party, to deport tens of thousands of non-citizen labor activists and activists, and to go after anarchists and radicals of all stripes. Or you can look at the Red Scare of the 1950s, something which is of particular importance to an organization to which I belong, the National Lawyers Guild, as we were a particular target of it. But not just for the terrible effects that the Red Scare had on individual lives, on people who were subjected to witch hunt, but that the real purpose and effect of it was to gut the radical labor movement in this country for decades, if not until the present, and to to expel leftists and radicals from the labor unions and to isolate them. And so it's not just a matter of kind of an individual effect that these types of laws have, but there's a political purpose behind many of them ultimately. The particular law we're talking about here, which was the subject of the Supreme Court decision this summer, was passed in 1996 as part of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, signed by a Democratic president, President Bill Clinton. The particular provisions of it, which I think are really the ones that cause the most concern to the exercise of free speech and the right to dissent, were passed as part of the Patriot Act in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And that expanded material support well beyond what we would ordinarily think of in terms of money or concrete support, to include providing personnel, training, and what I would consider to be fairly vague and very broad definitions. Of course, that was a law passed on a bipartisan basis by legislators who barely read it, with very little public debate. That brings us up these.
Except for Russ Feingold.
Okay. The specific decision was Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project this summer, and it involved the Humanitarian Law Project, which wanted to provide services to a couple organizations which were designated as foreign terrorist organizations under this law. The law provides that the Secretary of State, in currently her sole and unreviewable discretion, can designate any organization to be a designated terrorist organization. The organization has a 30-day window from publication of that notice in the Federal Register to file a challenge to that designation. You aren't allowed to see the evidence that's being used to classify you as a designated terrorist organization. I'm not aware of any organization has ever, within that 30-day window, actually, brought a challenge. An individual who is criminally charged under the law with supporting one of these organizations has no right to challenge that designation. The Humanitarian Law Project wanted to provide assistance to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is an opposition group in Turkey, certainly engaged in armed struggle with the Turkish government. You can look at it, and I think you probably come to the conclusion that both sides have killed a lot of people in the course of the Civil War. But the Humanitarian Law Project wanted to train the Workers' Party in how to present petitions to the United Nations, to try to, and other training in how to resolve their grievances peacefully, and to bring those grievances forward in a way other than armed struggle. And under this law, they're prohibited from doing so. The logic of the law is that if you provide such services to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, that's going to free up resources that they're then going to use to carry out these terrorist acts. So instead of the lawyers, that you train running off to the UN, all those lawyers would be free to take up arms, I guess, would be the logic of the law. The law has often been talked about. A lot of organizations, including many libertarian organizations that would actually, generally be seen as on the right, had real concerns about the law. The Rutherford Institute was a public interest libertarian law firm that filed an appellate brief. They talked about how Christian peacemaker teams that went into Iraq to try to provide Red Crescent services to people who were arbitrarily detained by the U.S. and by the Iraqi government in the aftermath of the invasion in 2003, that they could be charged for just providing prisoner support services, teaching prisoners how to challenge their detention, raising questions about the lack of evidence and the arbitrary nature of their detention, or trying to gain them access to the Red Crescent so they could let their families know that they were alive and how they were being treated. People have thought that Jimmy Carter could be tried under the law for going into Lebanon with the Carter Center and providing training in how to hold fair elections. Because you can't train people how to hold fair elections in Lebanon unless you work with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the largest or second largest political party in Lebanon, and they're part of the elected government there, but they're also a designated terrorist organization. And so basically what the Supreme Court said in this summer was that they upheld the law to bar all these types of support. They said it did not infringe on your First Amendment freedom because you still could hold, at least in your own mind, if you didn't say it very loudly, the opinion that Christian peacemaker teams should be able to go into Iraq and provide those services. Or you could hold in your own mind any opinion that you wanted about a designated terrorist organization. Theoretically, they claimed you could even be a member of such organizations as long as you don't do any activity on behalf of it. Or theoretically, you could speak your own individual opinion. However, you can be charged under the law if the government believes that you are coordinating your speech with a designated terrorist organization. So in this case, for kind of some immediate local relevance, for instance, then, is there are people that have, in this community, that have a different view of what's going on in Colombia than perhaps the U.S. government has, in terms of whether the U.S. government should open up military bases in Colombia, make Colombia the third or fourth largest recipient of military aid, all in the midst of a 30-some-year or longer civil war occurring in Colombia, where some folks think the government's controlled by landowners and big business, and that there are peasant and union movements that are the target of that government. Whether you agree with that or not, there are people that go down to Colombia to try to investigate and talk to people involved in both sides of the armed conflict there. You come back, and if you then speak about your views or what you learned while you were there, there's really a good chance that you could be considered to be coordinating your speech with someone that you may have met with, whether or not you know they're part of or not part of a designated terrorist organization. That may seem of a, okay, how many people are going to travel down to Colombia and speak with both sides of the armed conflict? Not very many. But what it really does is it creates a much of really strong chilling effect, particularly for someone who's not an activist, maybe not an ideologue of any sort, to say, do I even want to touch this type of debate, this type of organization, this type of activity with a 10-foot pole? Because if I even get close to getting involved in it, do I want the FBI knocking on my door, coming to my place of work to talk to me, talking to my employers, and I don't want anything to do with this issue. And to me, then, the law becomes a weapon not just in suppressing speech, as we think about speech in our minds, but really about suppressing dissent and enforcing a straitjacket upon the ability to question U.S. foreign policy. And I would just, I guess my piece of this would be that I think if we're a democracy, it's important to preserve alternative strands of analysis about our past. So some people could see the Mexican-American War in the mid-1800s as, a defense of the nation where our veterans, because they're part of the U.S. Army, were valiantly defending the United States. Other people might see it as a land grab, an aggressive war of territorial acquisition. You go up to the Spanish-American War, and there was a platoon from Minnesota, actually, that served in the Philippines. And they actually, basically laid their arms down because they saw themselves as coming in on behalf of the United States and suppressing an indigenous rebellion against the Spaniards. Preserving those strains where you don't just define one side of the past as the terrorist and one side as, the good guys in the war. My guess is 30 or 40 years from now, we may have a different analysis of some of these conflicts. In the 1980s, the official U.S. government position was that the African National Congress was a terrorist organization. Well, now Nelson Mandela is now held up, virtually by all political parties as a hero, which he legitimately is. The FMLN in El Salvador in the 1980s, we didn't have this law in effect, but had it been in effect, would have been a terrorist organization. They're now the elected government of El Salvador. Preserving the ability of U.S. citizens, activists, and non-citizens to have different views about these conflicts and to hold to them, and really fundamentally different views about which side is right, to engage in that debate, to question foreign policy, is really, and to organize to support those views, not just to hold them independently in your head, I think is vital if we're going to challenge some of the military and industrial interests that hold incredible sway over our government and over our foreign policy. So to me, this law is about more than just free speech, it's about dissent, and it's really about fundamental issues that, things that happen over there that have a tremendous effect upon our lives here.
This is wonderful democracy. I'm up from the 2nd district, so I've never seen anything like this down there. And what I'll just echo Bruce's, what we're doing now is we're really fighting for democracy, especially after 9 years of war. You'll always see these moments. The Sedition Act during World War I, you're going to see the Cold War was the House Un-American activities, and you're going to see Vietnam with the COINTELPRO abuses. You're always going to see these stresses on democracy arise during wartime. And as a war gets longer and more difficult to turn around and to end, you're going to see even greater amounts of repression. And actually, you will see people resorting to desperate measures. And during Vietnam, the weathermen did exist. So this is inevitable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of pick up where Bruce left off. He described the material support to terrorism law really well. I'll just add a couple of things to that. First of all, the Humanitarian Law Project case, that was a shock that it lost in the Supreme Court. The Georgetown law professor, David Cole, really could not believe this could happen in the United States. It does encroach so significantly on free speech, it's incredible. And people on the right, the libertarians, are just as angry about this because, in essence, it gives the government this huge amount of discretion. In addition to the categories he mentioned, of course, peace activists, Christian peacemakers, think about somebody like Greg Mortensen. Greg Mortensen has met with the Taliban. He's got a picture in his book. It's his only successful way of getting consensus in Afghanistan and Pakistan to build schools for girls. And in fact, his success stems from the fact that he's not affiliated with the U.S. government and that he's doing this as an independent person. That's actually more successful. If you go in there and try to build hospitals and somehow you have the CIA backing and stuff, you're not going to be as effective. So missionaries, the other two entities are lawyers. I can't really recite it, but lawyers who give advice could be caught up in this. Also, journalists, especially independent journalists, who are talking, remember all that reporting from inside Iraq, where we had independent journalists who were getting out the truth of these things long before WikiLeaks did? So all of that group of people, just 4 or 5 days ago, the Star Tribune had a pretty good article, and the title was "Helping Solve Terrorism or Stifling Speech." I think the title was something like that. Did you guys read that article? It's worth pulling up. And that article had the counter argument to supporting the material support came from a law professor. I don't see him in the crowd. William Mitchell law professor John Radson was the viewpoint that this is fine, it's good, you better not travel to foreign countries. Actually, he's got a quote in there that basically says, why would you even risk running afoul of this law by going to foreign countries and talking to anyone. Now, that's precisely what the argument was, is that it's going to have this huge chilling effect on perfectly legal activities. And he's actually now so emboldened. By the way, John Radson was the CIA Assistant Legal Counsel under Bush during the time that they decided to waterboard. The article doesn't mention that. He actually worked for John Rizzo when they destroyed the tapes of waterboarding. So that's who we have on the counter-argument. I'm going to quickly try to touch on more. The Humanitarian Law Project is the most direct reason for the raids on the activists, but there's more things going on. And I've picked up 5 or 6 and written a paper, so if I don't get them all covered, I brought a few extra copies of this. In addition to my having worked as an FBI agent for 24 years, I actually taught the FBI constitutional criminal procedure type law for 13 years prior to 9/11. So I know whereof I speak. I do know how difficult it is. The constitutional contours of the 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 6th Amendment are very difficult for FBI agents to understand. We were mandated to do 4 times a year an entire day of training. In the old days before 9/11, that training that was mandated to the FBI was supposed to start with the First Amendment. And it was supposed to start by us reminding all of the FBI about the First Amendment rights that happened in the Cispies case. Remember the Cispies? El Salvador or whatever. We were supposed to start our teaching with a reminder not to make these mistakes that the FBI made in the Cispies case. Now that of course, I'm quite afraid all went down the tubes after 9/11. A lot of things went down the tubes after 9/11. And the first thing was the Attorney General guidelines that had come on as a result of the Church Committee. The Church Committee was the result of the COINTELPRO abuses. In the 60s, they put microphones in Martin Luther King's hotel rooms. They black bag jobs. They sowed dissent in different groups. They did all these crazy things. In 1976, the number 3 guy in the FBI finally told the truth. And he said, when he was testifying before the Church Committee, well, when we sat around the table dreaming these things up, by the way, one of the things was an anonymous letter from the FBI that suggested to Martin Luther King that he might as well commit suicide before accepting his Peace Prize. So, really awful stuff. He said, no one raised their hand and said, is it moral, is it legal, is it ethical? And, you know, again, you get into these environments during Vietnam War where people, the legality, the ethics just go up in smoke. People don't even remember there is such a thing as ethics and legal rules. So what happened was these Attorney General guidelines that put restrictions on targeting advocacy groups, civil rights groups. Basically what they did is they said that you had to show some level of suspicion or factual justification before you could send an FBI informant into the group, before you could start tape recording, all of these things, before you could start surveilling, tracking. Ashcroft started to loosen those guidelines right after 9/11, and everybody remembers the famous that the FBI now could go into the mosques. That was the first thing. They weren't completely done away with, though, right off the bat. But over the years, over these last 9 years, they slowly were eroded, and to the point where you get almost the last official act of President Bush was he totally did away with all of the prior guidelines. And what it did is it switched the presumption. The presumption used to be that you had to have factual justification, some level, minimal, but you had to have some level. That now, the new presumption, and you're going to hear an FBI boss, and you're going to hear people in the government always say, deny. What they have to do is they have to deny that they are targeting a group solely based on First Amendment rights. That's the new level. The presumption just switched. And it's quite a simple matter to deny that that you are targeting a group solely based on their First Amendment rights. In fact, I can only think of one example, which is if Bruce Nestor writes a letter to the editor. I hope all of you will be writing letters to the editor on these issues. But if the FBI was to read the paper, see a letter to the editor, and say, okay, we're opening a case based on that letter to the editor. That's about the only example I can think of. So even the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, when he's begun his inquiries, and right now, the Department of Justice Inspector General has inquiries about abuses since 9/11. It's a stat. I mean, I'm guessing, but I know that there's 7 or 8 of these major 300-400 page findings already. First, there was one on handling of informants. There was one on the FBI's national security letters. They served several 100,000 of these. Most recently, this was ironic because you had those raids on the 24th, September 24th. On September 20th or 21st, the Inspector General for the Department of Justice put out a finding that the FBI from 2001 to 2006 had improperly targeted all kinds of groups, including Greenpeace and PETA and the Thomas Merton Center, Quakers. There's just a whole bunch of these. And so the thing is, he stopped, his inquiry stopped in 2006, just because that was when Leahy had asked for this to occur. And in the course of that IG thing, you know what else they found out? That the FBI director had actually lied to the head of the Judiciary Committee, Leahy. It was an inadvertent lie based on the improper targeting of an anti-war rally, I think in Pittsburgh. And the way that this happened, the poor FBI Director Mueller said this, was because the agent or the legal counsel in Pittsburgh had told him a fib. So there was this kind of like, the fib made it so we can't get intelligence to go to the top, but we can get incorrect information. So the upshot of this is that we're not the only activists who are criticizing. We have actually high-level people in the government who are seeing this happen, and they don't know what to do about it either. I will just mention the IG that covers the FBI. He's worth contacting to ask him to go further after 2006. And the reason is he's not under the FBI director. He's independent. Also, I just happened to, we can note that the day that we had the rally outside the FBI, which was 2 days after the FBI raids here, that was another. The IG put out another finding just that day. I kind of wonder if he wasn't timing it or something, because he put out a finding that day that the FBI was cheating on its own internal tests. They were actually sharing the answers on a test that they had to pass about the targeting of advocacy groups. And that was actually, I mean, it's incredible, the coincidence here. So the AG guidelines are no more, and you couple that with being in preemptive mode. Bruce Nestor and I were on Amy Goodman on the day, the first day of the RNC, and that afternoon, Amy Goodman got arrested in St. Paul. And we were talking about preemption that morning. And of course I said, this never used to happen. We used to never think that we could preempt 100% of all, certainly terrorist acts, 100% of all crime. Can you imagine what happens when you have that level and that kind of pressure of saying you're going to preempt all wrongdoing? Of course you become very reckless and you become very inaccurate. The second thing I'll just mention here is the blurring of protest activities with terrorism. And of course I mentioned in wartime that it's very difficult to understand that if you're in a war on terror and you're protesting the war on terror, that somehow the logic is that now you are not a terrorist. And actually, that was actually said by this California law enforcement spokesperson right when the starting, there was an anti-war targeting in California, and they said, well, why are you targeting the anti-war group in California? And his comment was, you can make an easy kind of link that if you have a protest group protesting a war where the cause that's being fought against is international terrorism, you might have terrorism at that protest, said Van Winkle. You can almost argue that a protest against the war on terror is a terrorist act. That was in 2003. Our Department of Defense has been giving for many, many years, it's too bad Chuck isn't here because we could give him applause, the ACLU found out that the Department of Defense was giving a test, and on that test was a question, and the question is, give us an example, what is an example of low-level terrorism? And you know what the answer to the question was? Protest. So you can see why it's very difficult to keep these things straight.
Questions from the
Okay. I've got more of these factors, but what we're doing is we're creating a perfect storm. Even if you were trying very hard not to make mistakes, all of these things now are leading to a kind of a perfect storm where mistakes and opportunistic problems are going to occur in law enforcement. And I do hope that everyone who cares about democracy and cares about, you know, good law enforcement would actually pick up the cause now and write about this and get it out to more people. Because very few people really understand what it's all about.
Thank you very much, I have a quick question to start off our questions from the audience. And I read the Supreme Court decision, and I encourage everybody to read it. You can find it online. I can't think of one of the more critical Supreme Court decisions of my lifetime, and I think it's going to affect us for several decades to come. I did invite FBI to be here. Two people specifically were invited. Neither one was able to be here due to prior commitments. But I want to just play devil's advocate based on John Roberts' rationale in the decision. The dissenting decision pointed out one of the absurdities of this law, which is that people still have the First Amendment right of assembly, meaning you can still meet with a terrorist group and not be guilty of violating the doctrine of supplying material aid. You can be a member of a terrorist group and still have your First Amendment rights protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So, given that, the definition here is that you cannot have activities coordinated with the terrorist group, but you may engage in independent advocacy. Explain that. If you can. David Cole, who brought this case forward, said, the court has declared the First Amendment permits the government to make peace advocacy a crime, while there's no evidence in the case that teaching human rights furthers terrorism. And the Washington Legal Foundation, which supported Roberts' ruling, said there's no such thing as good aid to a terrorist group, because all aid is fungible. And a good extendable decision goes into this definition of fungibility. And the idea is, if you are registering voters with Hamas, you are freeing up resources for Hamas to then buy more bombs. Thus, coordinated activity with Hamas to register voters, although it's a legal activity, and although you being with Hamas is not illegal, and being a member of Hamas is not illegal, you could still be guilty of material aid to terrorism for registering voters. So, fungibility, which won the day at the Supreme Court. How do Americans who have disagreements with the U.S. and foreign policy and are trying to follow a policy of engagement that President Obama has called for with our enemies, how do they navigate in this weird space that the Supreme Court has defined?
I think you do so with great caution and some sense of risk to yourself. But the law, for instance, specifically exempts medical and religious aid Of course, this whole fungibility analysis would apply too. You know, if, let's say there's a cholera outbreak in an area controlled by a designated terrorist organization. Well, if you go and help rehydrate children who are dying of cholera, then you're freeing up resources that might otherwise be used by the de facto government in the area, and they could go use those resources to commit a terrorist act. And so, at least under a pure First Amendment analysis, one of the points the dissent made was this is really a content-based, you know, distinctions. You can't provide legal assistance in how to draft a petition to the United Nations, but you can't provide, theoretically, medical or religious assistance. Beyond that, I mean, it's the effect that it has as to, there are just absolutely no bright lines as to what coordination involves or what the government may deem coordination to be. And so that, although you may have the right to assemble, if you talk and gather information, if you come back and repeat that information, you know, are you being an independent advocate, or are you being a press relations, public relations spokesperson for a designated terrorist organization? If the government gets to make that decision and then to charge you, and then to bring in all your First Amendment activity and all your public statements as proof of your intent, because you may issue public statements questioning U.S. foreign policy, expressing some different understanding of an organization abroad. So they'll say they're not targeting you solely for your First Amendment activity, but they're going to bring all that into your trial as evidence of what your intent was at those meetings or in terms of statements that you've made. And so I think there's this content-based issue in terms of this fungibility argument, as well as, again, this whole chilling effect in that the law reaches so much associational activity that it really prevents you from doing any of that without a fear of prosecution.
And I'm just going to pick up on the pragmatic, practical side of this. In a practical side, the chilling effect comes from the FBI, of course, this contours, legalities are very difficult to understand. If there is a distinction, it would be incredibly difficult to understand. So what you're going to do is you're going to investigate. And you are going to execute search warrants and serve grand jury subpoenas. And you'll say, well, we're finding out if it actually approaches this line. Actually, you will also receive information from political groups that are opponents of whatever, you know, regime or whatever you have going on. So when the FBI sets up shop, it says, if you have information on somebody furnishing material aid, please come and tell us about it. Who do you think comes in and tells them about a possible infraction? Well, it's usually the groups that have opposing agendas. So that is actually the source of the information. And of course now they're perfectly legitimized to open up a case, execute search warrants, and this is where this terrible chilling effect comes from. And you actually now have government attorneys recommending, just play it safe, folks, don't do any of these things. And honestly, I've had many people now, I can't tell you the hundreds of people, because I do encourage writing and speaking out. It's the number one thing we should be doing. Writing, no, independent, don't call up the FARC first and say, draft my letter to the editor for me. Use your own mind, your own thoughts, and write your own letter to the editor. The idea now is, you know, I've had hundreds of people tell me there's no way I am going to put my name out there with something like this because I'm afraid I will get in the crosshairs. And that's where the real damage is.
Thank you, Coleen. And before we turn to questions, we wanted to invite Representative Karen Clark to come and talk to us about what's been happening in the legislature.
Thank you. Yes, I did want to share with you what we did during the legislative special session. We put a press release out, but I haven't seen too much about it, and maybe y'all can help me get the word out. I did go down to the rally after the event. Rage, I don't know, makes me so angry. And my outrage there led me to, just a couple days later, we had the special session, remember, about the floods? So we put together a resolution that basically condemned the act, called on President Obama and our U.S. senators and congresspeople from Minnesota to pull back the FBI and halt this intimidation. And we contained in our language for that resolution a lot of what was in the AFSCME language petition resolution that came out. And we put that on the table for our legislative colleagues. And I want to tell you, just a couple things that I didn't hear said today. I don't know if you know this, but 8 of the 9 people targeted here in Minnesota were women. 6 of them, I believe, are active trade unionists, very active, AFSCME and Teamsters. 2 of the households rated were lesbian. I bring the last part up because I lived through the 70s and 80s and 60s even, when lesbian households were targeted. I don't know if you know that. Lesbian organizations, I should say. So I took this to my legislative colleagues in the House of Representatives, and I asked Senator Linda Berglund to take it to the Senate. We both did, and I want to tell you we had overwhelming support. The Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, most of the DFLs, yes, they all deserve your support. Remember that all of us are up for elections, so some of them should hear from you. Thank you. I was just talking to someone earlier who was asking me about a person who didn't sign. There were a couple of people who said, boy, I sure do want to sign this. These are Democrats in the House, but I'm afraid of re-election. But most of the Democrats in the House did sign it. And so the safety in numbers, we had our leadership. And I think the point about speaking up is just so important. And I think the thing that really helped me get my colleagues to sign up, I gave a very strong speech about the suppression that was similar to what happened in the Palmer raids, what happened in the 50s and so on with McCarthy, the anti-war movement, the trade union suppression, and that has brought people aboard. So I'm actually encouraging my city council members and other levels of government to do the same thing. I think we need our elected officials to try to raise this issue with our U.S. congresspeople and with Obama. And I just want to say thank you to the brave people who did this work, and that we all just need to leave behind our silence and speak up, because it's really the only way that we can preserve our democracy. And I thank you both for your analysis. And I want to read your papers today. I'll share it with you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And again, my name is Elizabeth Glidden, by the way. I know there's a lot of 9th Ward residents here. I'm the 8th Ward representative on the City Council. I wanted to say just a couple words and then turn it over to Gary about some specific conversations he has had with our U.S. senators about this issue. One of the things that we do in the city is we have a federal legislative agenda, and we do lobbying with our congressional delegation. And an issue that has been brought up that may be something more tangible and specific that we can do and perhaps ask other cities and communities to do is to ask that Congress establish congressional oversight through the Judiciary Committee over what is happening with the FBI. Right now, Congress needs to take responsibility. We know what the courts have said through the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is another very specific avenue where Congress needs to take responsibility, knows what to happen. Coleen Rowley talked about the extreme discretion that is going on right now. So it is time for Congress to take responsibility through Congressional Oversight Committee. So that is one specific tangible thing. I'm going to talk to Gary about have Gary talk about his conversations.
Well, Elizabeth pretty much summed it up. I spoke with Congressman Tim Walz from Minnesota's 1st District. I spoke with U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, and I've spoken with the office of Keith Ellison, but haven't been able to talk directly to him. Both Tim and Amy said Keith is the perfect person on the Judiciary Committee. Apparently they both forgot that Keith is no longer on the Judiciary Committee. So how do we establish oversight successfully of a bill that Congress passed, that the Supreme Court has upheld? And maybe this is a question for Coleen. Is there a hope to have a checks and balances? Because the Supreme Court case was a result of a proactive lawsuit from a peace organization saying this is going to interfere with our First Amendment rights to do legal activities. And then they lost it. Have others been prosecuted? And is this what's happening in the war on terror? We're now prosecuting people who register voters in Colombia and in other cities around the world?
they're actually, the Judiciary Committee are the committees that actually held these church committees and pike committees back in the 1970s. So they are the proper committees, both the Senate and the House. They actually, there's broader issues even than the Humanitarian Law Project at issue here. There have been other abuses. Although the abuses stemming from the Humanitarian Law Project are just occurred in June. Actually, the government was probably rightly thinking that this would not work, but then they heard from the Supreme Court, so there's just been a small amount of time. The Congress needs to exercise oversight. There's also another thing. If you people remember way back to the 9/11 Commission report, $10 for the book, by the way, still out there. They had 3 of their 41 recommendations. That's a lot. That's 3 of 41. That's a sizable amount of that report devoted to the creation of a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And the reason they were so concerned is because they knew the Patriot Act. They knew this was starting already. All of these broader authorities. And they actually devote many pages to saying, well, we know that there's going to be this problem, so we need to have a board. When I was on with the FBI SAC recently, and he just kind of says, well, we know it when we see it, material support to terrorism. And we deny that we are targeting solely based on First Amendment rights. My question to him when we were off air, my question was, Mr. Ralph Bolter, Mr. Bolter, wouldn't you want to have a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board? When the CIA, for instance, is starting to torture people in Guantanamo, and the FBI witnessed it, they didn't have anyone to go to report this to. Wouldn't you want to have an outside agency that you could report these true terrible abuses to? And he had no response. But that's exactly, that Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board was forced on Bush. He actually was forced to appoint 5 people, but then he pulled the rug from under it right away and made it null and void. Finally, the only Democrat on the committee resigned and said, this is nonsense. I can't even be a part of this anymore. And then it sat vacant all of that time. Then President Obama comes in thinking, okay, maybe we'll get something, and he has let it sit. There is no Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, even though there's a law mandating that it exists because of the serious reason.
I'm trying to understand the dynamics of the decision to make the raids and the response to the raids. And so I'm wondering if anybody has any informed speculation about how high up the authorization went for the raids to occur. Was the FBI director specifically involved in making that decision? Did it go to the Attorney General? Was somebody on the President's staff itself making this decision? Yes, let's target peace activists. And the second part of my question is about response. I'd love to know any speculation that you have, Gary. I know you and I have been back and forth about Keith would be the perfect person to actually comment. He has not. But I'm also wondering about the 2 council members who are right here. I actually haven't heard from either one of you on the question of this particular, which I consider is an abuse of police power. How deep does this go? How high up, and what's going on at the bottom? Why hasn't there been a massive governmental outreach into this?
Maybe Coleen can speak from her experience, but my guess is, I mean, I think any sort of investigation which is carried out under the rubric of terrorism goes up very high. This involved mobilization of resources in at least 2 states where search warrants were carried out, and 3 others where people were simultaneously approached and interviewed, all on a single day. And so all that is going to be coordinated at the highest levels of the Justice Department. My guess is it would not have extended directly into the political branch, at least in any way with a documented paper trail. But, you know, that's kind of speculation after that. My guess is that, you know, it goes up to the, and they had to know who they were dealing with. Gary asked the question, has this law been used? And people, you know, of course, have been prosecuted. Primarily, it's been individual Muslims in this country, individual Arab Americans who are not directly affiliated with any sort of political organization or engaged in political activity. There was a Saudi American student prosecuted in Idaho for running an internet site where he had links to jihadist organizations. You know, regardless of what you think about that content, there was no allegation that he did anything other than create this website. Typically something you would think of as an act of speech. He was actually acquitted by a jury. There was another individual prosecuted in New York for wanting to put Hezbollah TV on cable TV. Again, regardless of what you think about that message, and you know, in this age of information, you tend to think if they were sending out coded instructions, they didn't need a TV channel to do it. There's a lot of ways to communicate in this world nowadays. He ended up pleading guilty because he was so afraid of the potential penalties that he would face. It's used as a charge that's often then brought with great fanfare, public press conferences by the highest levels of the Justice Department, and then 2 to 3 years later, people plead out to something like giving a false statement to the FBI, and the material support charges are dropped because the evidence really isn't there, and that's not typically covered by the press. Liz Stewart's a lawyer with the National Lawyers Guild who was also prosecuted under this law, pretty much for acts of speech.
My knowledge in the FBI is that this information doesn't necessarily get all the way to the places it needs to get. That's been a continual problem. And then the information that does get up to higher levels sometimes gets garbled in the meantime. So I'm not 100% sure who actually evaluated this. Certainly after June, there is the idea now that this broader authority given by the Supreme Court decision will mean that it has to be tested. And so bringing test cases and pushing it to the nth limit was going to happen sooner or later. I think a lot of this is based on opportunism. I have a whole second speech I'm not going to give you right now about true terrorism and the problems that the FBI and other agencies face in reducing true terrorism. You're going to find that it hasn't been done very well at all. Now that little cartoon that I'm circulating here is basically that there's been no real act of real terrorism stopped by anybody in the government. They've been stopped by alert t-shirt vendors in New York City. They've been stopped by flight passengers on planes. They have not actually been detected. All of this vacuuming of information that's being done is actually hurting their ability to detect and actually reduce true terrorism.
Okay, I want to start, and I'll turn to Gary on answering the question about your elected officials and city council in particular. Let me just point out this first. The point of an event like this is to raise the profile of this issue and to not let it drop. So I want to say, in part, this is one very important piece. We have Pam Colby here from MTN. We have the uptake here. They are also part of the important goal of hosting an event like this and not letting it drop. That's part of what we're doing. We talked just a moment ago about a specific kind of action we can do. There are things that you can do as a city council member. I'll just tell you, I do a press release. No one picks that up. Okay? Let me just be honest with you. Another thing that can happen at the city council is sometimes we pass resolutions. I personally think it's best to pass a resolution or do something like that if you're connecting it to a concrete action that we're hoping to do. We just talked about one of those things, which is what we might ask to include on our federal legislative agenda.
And I've called for a meeting with the Minneapolis office of the FBI, along with Elizabeth, and so I'll get back to you on whether or not they take up that, but I do hope they will meet with the Minneapolis City Council. Keith Ellison has a meeting with the Minneapolis FBI office on November 2nd, and I think he's going to be talking more about the outcome of that meeting after it's held. But I'm really questioning the uses of city resources. I don't know if this is known to people in the room. City of Minneapolis participates in the Joint FBI Terrorism Task Force. We have 2 full-time police officers assigned to the Joint Task Force. I don't feel good not knowing what Minneapolis police officers are doing. We didn't feel comfortable when we found out what the gang strike force was doing, so we pulled our officers out of the gang strike force. So I want to meet with the FBI, find out what the direction they are headed in. If, again, the war on terrorism has become prosecuting peace activists from South Minneapolis who register voters overseas, is now the targeted approach that they're taking, then those are resources that I don't want my city dollars to go towards. From the back, yep.
It's a question for Coleen. In a way, it's the same question as the first one. I'd like to hear a little more about that. The reporting after this first happened was that it was the Joint Terrorism Task Force that's where it started. Do you think that's true? And there's a guy named Ken Love, who supposedly heads the task force. He's on their website. Is he the guy, or is it, or what?
So just to repeat the question, if everyone didn't hear it, the question is, was it the joint FBI task force that executed the search warrants and got
Well, did they, I mean, is that where the authority came from?
And is that where the authority came from?
Yes, I'm certain that the Joint Terrorism Task Force was the entity executing the search warrants. It actually would always be the entity. The FBI controls the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. So these police officers, for instance, from the city or the state that go on it, they're not even allowed to report to their own bosses in the hierarchy of the chain. So for instance, if a Minneapolis police officer was on that and he was told to do something, I mean, I'm just going to make up an extreme example. Let's say he was told to use some harsh interrogation tactics. Actually, the FBI is the only agency that didn't believe in those things. But let's just assume that. There's CIA on these joint terrorism task forces, too. So let's assume that he was told that. He could not even really take that up. He could be gagged, in essence, because he's serving on the federal joint terrorism task forces. The other problem that comes from this blending of jurisdictions is that in the old days, the city and the state were more, their jurisdiction was more into crowd control. For instance, the FBI would never have a reason to monitor a parade or a march. That wasn't federal jurisdiction. But when you get into blending all of these jurisdictions together, including even overseas foreign intelligence collection with the CIA, now you actually have this broader authority to do things that were originally state and local all the way to... So there's a lot of problems with the Joint Terrorism Task Force that have never been asked. And the city, the people in our state and local governments have that power. Because they can't actually, there is another state that's done this. I forget which state, but there's been another state that's actually questioned the participation of their own officers on the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Carrie Ann?
Well, first I want to say, being an activist and being in the experience like this right now, this issue has been something that's on the fringe, and for you guys to take this up right now is beyond just raising it to a new level. It's taking it out of the fringe and getting it to other people who otherwise aren't even going to look at the issue, even if they heard about it. The fact that you guys are standing up for this is really, really, really important, and I feel like if there's more people that are like you at a local level who can bring it to other people, we're going to have a chance. And I really want to thank you for that. And then secondly, my thought is that when we look at this issue right now, I really feel like what we're experiencing is a strategy. We're experiencing a symptom. We're experiencing something that's coming out of something, and we have to ask ourselves, why is this happening in the first place? Why do they care to do this? And the answer always is follow the money. The two things that we know are driving our economy right now are is oil and drugs. Those are the two things that are really important. And war, but to get there, the war is also a reason. The war is something that keeps us to get the oil and the drugs going and keep our economy profiting. And I just want everyone in this room to remember that every single time you open your wallet to buy your food, to buy everything that you buy, remember who that money is going to. Because it's the corporations corporations that are behind this, that are funding this in the first place. And if all of us turned around and figured out ways to make our food local and to keep the dollars in our local economy so that we aren't having all of those profits go to Monsanto, who are doing the GMO, to hurt us. And the fact that one of the first things that went into the Constitution in Iraq when we invaded was we changed it so that the farmers could no longer save their own seed. And we made it so that they were forced to purchase Monsanto GMO Terminator seeds so that they could only buy one crop and then it died. That was, I mean, the corporate control, that is the biggest reason. So I just want to reiterate that right now. And I know you guys are aware, but I want to bring that into our minds at this time.
Bob, I'll just hand the mic to you. You want to? No? Okay.
So, to follow on what you were just saying, which is very good.
Hi, I know many of you, but not all of you. My name is Jess Sundin, and I live about a half-mile away. My home was one of the homes raided on September 24th. Mine and my daughter, Layla. We really appreciate people's interest in this case. Obviously, it's very personal for us. There's a lot at risk for us. Our family could be torn apart depending on how this goes. You know, both myself and my partner were issued subpoenas to appear before a grand jury in Chicago. Those of you who know me as a peace activist, and something that I believe very strongly in, and it's something that's very important to our family. I've been involved in other community issues, but I wanted to just add to the discussion, the anti-war committee offices were raided as well. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about that they took from our office is, you know, they took our financial records, they took some papers and flyers, they took our computer, which has the names of thousands of people living in Minneapolis and St. Paul who've been coming to demonstrations for decades. You know, our organization started as a part of CISPAS, which Coleen referred to, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. So work here that has been being done since the 80s. It's recorded on this one computer that is now in the hands of the FBI. And I'm very concerned about this case widening to include the net widening to include all of us. And you know, really, it is a local community issue as much as it is a national issue, a question of laws, a question of our relations with other countries. But it's very personal and very, very human. And I want to ask all of you to really follow through on what you've learned today. And I hope that our city council can, we're also working, folks in Chicago are working on a city council resolution there as well. Those resolutions, we received more than 100 resolutions and solidarity statements of support from around the country, from trade unions and other community groups. And we're ready, and the Minnesota legislature took a big stand on our behalf recently, and we'd like to see more of that. We need everyone to have a part in this and have a voice in it. I really believe the one thing that I can do and that you can do to defend our freedom of speech is to use it. And I'm not going to stop speaking out for peace. I'm not going to stop speaking out for the people of Colombia and Palestine and Iraq and Afghanistan. And I hope that you won't either. And I hope that you'll consider continuing your efforts to end war and occupation at the same time as defending our civil liberties here. So thank you. Dave wisely suggested I tell you about the website where you can follow our case, stopfbi.net. Should be easy to remember. And I'll invite you to a Halloween party tonight at the Midtown Y starting at 6, which is a fundraiser for us.
Just don't show up as an FBI agent. That's too scary of a costume right now. Thank you everybody for being here, and I look forward to seeing you all final Friday in January for the 9th Ward Awards.